The primary question I want to ask today is, can we truly grasp the real image of Mary, an image that is neither oppressive nor exclusionary, but meaningful for everyone? So far, I have not found a satisfying answer. As we read the works of scholars who criticize the image of Mary, we encounter an important argument. If the sacred and the divine are ultimately formed through what we possess as human beings, and if these ideas are products of human consciousness, as Freud suggests, then how can they even become equally meaningful or pleasing to everyone if religion rests upon what Freud called an archaic formation? Then does every image of the sacred inevitably become subject to the explanations, experiences, and desires of the viewer? Does the sacred exist independently of us, or is it always reconstructed by those who behold it? A compelling example of this tension appears throughout feminist art history. For some scholars, traditional images of women should be dismantled and disregarded because they reinforce oppressive ideals. For others, those very same images represent an empowering celebration of suppression or suppressed voices and the collective cultural genealogy of women. The same image can therefore become two completely different things. One person sees suppression, another sees liberation. One sees the restriction of women, another sees a history of women that has survived through cultural representation. As Catherine McCormack, who I also mentioned in my earlier videos, observes, these continuing debates remind us that we still have not resolved how best to depict women's bodies in a visual language that is universally empowering and dignifying. Perhaps, however, this problem exists and extends far beyond the representation of women alone. For many aspects of human life, we constantly move between the opposing ideas of suppression and liberation without even fully escaping either. The truly divine image, the one capable of speaking to all humanity and making everyone feel equally touched by the sacred, may simply be much more difficult to discover than we imagine. Interestingly, the experience of sacredness itself seems to require us to move through countless emotions and assumptions that shape the way we perceive an image. Different traditions portray Jesus differently, and the degree of sacredness people experience also varies according to belief. The same is true of Mary. Sacredness exists less in language than in representation. It is through representation that an ordinary image comes to be regarded as sacred. The painter is not worshipped, rather the painting embodies the creative thought that passed through the artist and onto the canvas. But then something else happens. The viewer enters the process. Those who stand before the painting bring something of themselves into that encounter. Those who experience the image as demeaning find meaning within it through their own perspective. Those who find it inspiring bring something equally personal into their interpretation. In both cases, the viewer and the image participate together in creating meaning. And perhaps this is true of every encounter with art. Moving further into more abstract ideas, the image of Mary serves many different purposes. It may even offer clues about how she might actually have looked historically, as many paintings constantly portray her with a softly rounded face. But regardless of historical accuracy, every viewer attaches different thoughts, emotions, and beliefs to her image. What one person interprets as a reductive image shaped by religious idealism may appear to another as profoundly enlightening. The reason perhaps lies in what the title Mother of God truly signifies. For someone who does not believe in the divine, Mary may simply appear as a grieving mother mourning the death of a man who claimed to be God. For Christians, however, the image represents something without any worldly parallel: the union of the divine with humanity through Mary. But some interpret as Mary's loss of freedom the idea that her life was entirely devoted to a divine purpose. Others understand as the highest possible elevation of human intimacy. Throughout the history of art, women, and especially young maidens, have been painted countless times by artists across different cultures and centuries. Many of the greatest collections in the world's museums are filled with images of women painted not only by men, but also by women themselves. If we were shown such paintings without knowing who created them, could we reliably distinguish between those painted by male artists and those painted by female artists? Perhaps we could not. That fact itself is less significant than another question: how can we confidently define the image of Mary as an archetype of suppression? This is a claim that I still find difficult to comprehend fully, even though similar arguments may appear more convincing when applied to other historical figures. And this leads me to Artemisia Gentilliccia, if I am really pronouncing her name correctly. She's one of the greatest painters of the 17th century, celebrated for producing some of the most remarkable works of her time. So why introduce her here? Because like many artists throughout history, she painted numerous works featuring women. As students of art history, we are often reminded that the central question is not who painted the picture, but what the painting signifies. In a world largely shaped by male artist traditions, it is understandable to argue that women artists were also influenced by those traditions. Yet there is another question that is often overlooked. Was it truly an archetype of suppression that motivated these women to paint such work? And can we really assume that what we identify as suppression was experienced by the artist herself in the same way? This leads me to an idea that I have just coined for the purpose of this discussion: delightful suppression. By this I mean the possibility that the Virgin Mary's calm acceptance of the divine will exemplifies a form of serenity achieved through submission, a state in which restraint itself becomes a virtue rather than merely a limitation. But if suppression can genuinely be experienced as delightful, then what more can we say about suppression itself? Feminist scholars argue that this interpretation aestheticizes female passivity and emotional restraint, reflecting patriarchal ideas rather than authentic female experience. Yet, this immediately raises another question: what exactly is female experience? How do we define it? And even if we could arrive at a satisfactory definition, how could we faithfully represent such an experience in visual art? Many of the answers offered so far have emerged through psychoanalysis, particularly within the tradition of psychoanalytical feminist art theory. Framework examines both the production of reception and visual representation through the psychic structures of gendered subjectivity. Drawing upon Freudian and Lacanian thought, it argues that the visual field is never neutral. Instead, it is a space where desire, repression, and identification are organized according to the symbolic order of patriarchy. Within this framework, femininity is not understood as a fixed essence, but as a possession constructed within language and representation, continually mediated by what has been called the male gaze and by the philocentric organization of vision. Yet, this understanding of the visual field brings us back to what I believe is the central concern of the entire discussion: the idea of the sacred. If, as many scholars argue, the image of Mary represents the suppression of women, then how is it that the very same image has also come to symbolize one of the highest ideas of human existence for millions of believers? And if every symbol is ultimately nothing more than an expression of masculine hegemony, then how do we define a symbol of genuine elevation at all? My intention is not to deny that visual culture can contain structures of suppression. Clearly, it can. Rather, my question is different. What is the true image of liberation? What would a genuinely liberating image look like? One capable of speaking equally to everyone? Perhaps this is precisely the question for which I do not yet have an answer. It is the question that continues to drive my interest in what scholars working in this field have yet to say. Earlier, I mentioned how the very same image may be experienced and enlightening by one person and demeaning by another. Perhaps this difference lies not only in the image itself, but in the stories we carry with us. Those stories shape the realities through which we understand the world. In a sense, our realities remain real for as long as those stories continue to pursue us. The image of Mary stands at the edge of this uncertainty. What does she truly symbolize? Would her meaning remain the same if the artist's name and the title of the painting were removed and the image was shown to an ordinary viewer with no prior knowledge of Christian art? Perhaps I can never become that viewer. I already know how generations of artists imagined Mary, how they represented her, and perhaps even how they believed she may have looked in history. That knowledge inevitably shapes the way I now encounter her image, and perhaps that is the real difficulty. The image of Mary is never simply an image. It is always accompanied by a tradition, by theology, by history, by criticism, and by the stories we inherit before we ever stand before the painting itself. So perhaps the real image of Mary is not something that can simply be found. Perhaps it is something that is continually constructed between the image, the artist, the tradition, and the person looking at it. And that leaves us with the question I began with: what is the real image of Mary? Maybe the answer is not hidden inside the painting. Maybe the more important question is what we bring with us when we look at it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.